when I was 21. I spent a summer house sitting for a family friend, Karen, who lived in a large, secluded house deep in the woods. Karen and her husband were taking a month-long vacation in Europe, and they needed someone to watch the house and take care of their two golden retrievers. It sounded like the perfect setup. A month of peace and quiet, away from the chaos of the city, and I'd even get paid for it. The house was beautiful, a rustic cabin with wide windows that overlooked acres of forest. The nearest neighbor was about a mile away, and the driveway was a long gravel path that twisted through dense trees. During the day, the sunlight streaming through the canopy made the place feel idyllic. But at night, the woods seemed to transform into something much darker. The first week passed without incident. I spent most of my time reading on the porch, hiking with the dogs, and enjoying the solitude. Occasionally, I'd hear rustling in the underbrush or the distant hoot of an owl, but it was nothing unusual for the woods. By the second week, though, strange things started happening. It began with small, almost imperceptible things. I'd find the back door unlocked in the morning, even though I was certain I'd locked it the night before. Lights I didn't remember turning on would be left glowing in empty rooms. Once, I came back from a walk to find the fridge door slightly ajar. I figured I was just being forgetful. It was an old house, after all, and maybe the doors didn't latch properly. But as the days went on, the incidents became harder to ignore. One night, around midnight, I was lying in bed with the dogs curled up at my feet. The house was dark and quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. I was just starting to drift off when I heard it. A low, muffled voice coming from outside the window. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I sat up, straining to hear, but the voice had stopped. I told myself it must have been the wind, or maybe a bird. But then it came again. A whisper, faint but distinct. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like a man's voice, coming from somewhere in the woods. The dogs lifted their heads, their ears perked up, and they started growling softly. My stomach knotted. I grabbed my phone and crept to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside. The yard was empty, bathed in the pale light of the moon. The forest beyond was a wall of shadows. I tried to shake off the fear. It was probably just a trick of the wind, I thought, or maybe the sound of animals moving through the trees. I locked the bedroom door and left the light on as I tried to go back to sleep. But the whispers stayed with me, echoing in the back of my mind. The next morning, I found something strange on the porch. A single, muddy footprint, far larger than my own, was pressed into the wooden planks. It was fresh, the edges still damp. My heart raced as I stared at it, trying to convince myself it had been left by a hiker or a hunter. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. The house was miles from any public trail, and the footprint led to the porch, but there were no prints leading away. I spent the day feeling on edge, constantly glancing over my shoulder as I moved through the house. That evening, I made sure every door and window was locked, even checking them twice. I kept the dogs close, their collars jingling softly as they followed me from room to room. Just after midnight, the whispers started again. This time, they were louder, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from all around the house, as if the trees themselves were murmuring. The dogs barked and growled, pacing back and forth by the windows. I sat frozen on the couch, clutching a flashlight and a kitchen knife, too scared to move. The whispers grew louder, rising and falling in an eerie rhythm, until they were almost a chant. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was low and guttural, like the voices were coming from deep within someone's throat. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a group of people? A prank? Some kind of ritual? Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the back door, followed by the sound of something scraping against the wood. The dogs went wild, barking and clawing at the door. My hands shook as I dialed 911, barely able to form coherent sentences as I told the operator what was happening. As I waited for the police, the banging and scraping continued, now coming from multiple sides of the house. It sounded like someone, or something, was trying to get in. The dogs barked louder, their bodies pressed against the doors as they growled at whatever was outside. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence was deafening. Even the dogs seemed confused, their ears twitching as they listened. I stayed huddled on the couch, clutching the knife, until the sound of car tires crunching on the gravel driveway broke the stillness. The police found nothing. No footprints, no scratches on the doors, no sign that anyone had been there at all. They assured me it was probably just animals or my imagination, but I could tell they didn't believe their own words. Something about the way they avoided meeting my eyes told me they were just as uneasy as I was. I thought that would be the end of it, but the next night, it got worse. I was too scared to sleep, so I stayed up watching TV in the living room. Around 2 a.m., I heard a noise, a faint tapping on the glass. My blood ran cold as I turned toward the sliding door that led to the back porch. At first, I couldn't see anything, but then I noticed it. A dark figure standing just beyond the glass, its face obscured by shadows. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place. The figure didn't move, didn't try to open the door. It just stood there, staring at me. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed, but eventually, the figure turned and disappeared into the woods. I didn't sleep that night. When the sun finally rose, I packed my bags, loaded the dogs into the car, and left. I didn't care if Karen was upset. I wasn't staying another night. To this day, I don't know who or what was in those woods. All I know is that I've never felt fear like that before, and I hope I never do again. When I was 19, I lived with my grandmother in a small house on the outskirts of a quiet town. The house was old, the kind of place that had seen better days decades ago. It creaked and groaned with every gust of wind, and the walls were thin enough that you could hear every sound from the other side of the house. My grandmother wasn't in the best of health, and I stayed with her to help out while I took some college classes online. That night, however, I was alone. My grandmother had gone to visit my aunt for the weekend, leaving me in charge of the house. I'd stayed alone before, but something about that particular night felt different. It was late October, and the air had a chill that crept into the house no matter how high I turned up the heat. The wind outside howled like a living thing, rattling the windows and shaking the shutters. Still, I tried to tell myself it was just another night. It started around 9 p.m. I was sitting in the living room, scrolling through my phone while an old black and white movie played in the background. The house was dark except for the faint glow of the TV. I remember feeling strangely on edge, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Maybe it was the weather, or maybe it was just the eerie silence that filled the house between gusts of wind. I decided to make some tea to calm my nerves. The kitchen was just down the hall, but as I stood up and turned toward it, I froze. Something wasn't right. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it, like I was being watched. My heart raced as I scanned the room, but there was no one there. I shook my head, laughing nervously at myself, and walked to the kitchen. As I boiled the water and poured my tea, I tried to shake the feeling, but it clung to me like a shadow. It wasn't until I turned to leave the kitchen that I noticed it, the back door. It was wide open. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, my brain scrambling for an explanation. I was sure I'd locked it earlier. I could even remember the click of the bolt sliding into place. But now, it was swinging gently in the wind, the darkness of the backyard yawning beyond it. Gripping the counter for support, I forced myself to walk over and shut the door. I locked it, triple-checking the bolt, then pulled the curtains tight. My breathing was shallow, and my hands were clammy as I leaned against the door. Maybe I'd forgotten to lock it after all. Maybe the wind had pushed it open. That was the logical explanation, right? But deep down, I didn't believe that. I carried my tea back to the living room and tried to settle down, but the unease gnawed at me. Every little sound seemed magnified. The creak of the floorboards, the rustle of leaves outside, the faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. By the time the clock struck 11, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to do a sweep of the house, just to make sure everything was locked and secure. Starting with the living room, I checked every window and door. Then I moved to the kitchen, the bathroom, and finally the bedrooms. Everything seemed fine, but when I stepped into the hallway, I felt it again, that sensation of being watched. The hallway was dark, stretching out like a tunnel into the shadows. At the far end, I could just make out the faint outline of the door to the basement. It was slightly ajar. My stomach tightened. I hadn't gone into the basement all day. There was no reason for that door to be open. I told myself it was probably just the wind. Maybe I hadn't closed it all the way the last time I'd gone down there. Still, I couldn't bring myself to approach it. Instead, I went back to the living room and tried to convince myself I was overreacting. But then I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound, like something being dragged across the floor. It was coming from the basement. My heart stopped. I stared at the hallway, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. The shuffling continued, slow and deliberate, as if someone, or something, was trying to be quiet. Finally, I grabbed my phone and called the police. My voice was barely a whisper as I explained what was happening. The operator told me to stay on the line and lock myself in a room, but I couldn't take my eyes off the hallway. That's when I saw it. A shadow moved at the far end of the hall. It was faint, barely visible in the darkness, but it was there. It lingered near the basement door, then began to move toward me. I bolted. Sprinting upstairs, I locked myself in my bedroom and shoved a dresser against the door. My chest heaved as I struggled to catch my breath. The operator was still on the line, assuring me that officers were on their way. But the sound of my own heartbeat was so loud, I could barely hear her. Then came the footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. They climbed the stairs, one by one, until they stopped right outside my door. The doorknob rattled, and I nearly screamed. I pressed my back against the dresser, praying it would hold. For what felt like an eternity, everything was silent. Then, a single knock, loud and echoing, shook the door. "Who's there?" I finally managed to choke out, my voice trembling. There was no answer, just more silence. Then, after what felt like hours, the footsteps retreated, descending the stairs one by one. I stayed frozen in place until I heard the distant wail of sirens approaching. When the police arrived, they searched the house from top to bottom. The basement was empty, though they did find muddy footprints leading up the stairs. The back door, despite my triple checking, was unlocked again. They never found anyone, and there were no signs of forced entry. The officers told me it was probably just a homeless person looking for shelter, but I knew better. Whoever, or whatever, it was hadn't come to steal. They had been watching me. I stayed with my grandmother for another year, but I never spent another night there alone. To this day, I can't walk down a dark hallway without glancing over my shoulder. And I never leave a door ajar. I was 26 when it happened, and I still think about it every time I hear a strange noise in the middle of the night. It was late autumn, and I had recently moved into a duplex in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of a small town. The place had its quirks, creaky floorboards, drafty windows, but it was home. My girlfriend, Jenna, often stayed over, but she was visiting her parents that weekend, leaving me alone for the first time in a long while. The duplex was 2 stories, with my bedroom and an office upstairs. Downstairs was a cozy living room that connected to the kitchen and dining area. The back of the house opened onto a small, overgrown yard surrounded by a tall wooden fence. Beyond that was a patch of woods that separated the neighborhood from the main road. During the day, the yard had a sort of rustic charm, but at night, the woods became an inky black void. That evening, I decided to relax with a pizza and a crime documentary series I'd been meaning to catch up on. The living room was dimly lit, with just the warm glow of a lamp and the flickering light from the TV. Outside, the wind whistled faintly, carrying dry leaves across the yard. I'd left the sliding glass door cracked open earlier to let in some air, but I made sure to close and lock it as the night grew colder. Around 9 p.m., I was halfway through the second episode when I noticed something strange. I'd paused the show to grab another slice of pizza, and as I turned back toward the couch, my eyes drifted toward the glass door. At first, I thought it was just my reflection, but then I realized there was someone standing at the edge of the yard. The figure was tall and motionless, just beyond the reach of the neighbor's dim porch light. I froze, my heart pounding. For a moment, I convinced myself it was a trick of the light or a shadow cast by the trees. But then the figure shifted slightly, stepping forward just enough that I could see the faint outline of a face. Whoever it was, they were staring directly at the house. Trying to calm myself, I rationalized that it might be one of the neighbors. Maybe they'd lost something and wandered into the yard. Still, the situation felt wrong. The person wasn't moving or calling out, just standing there, watching. I turned off the TV and slowly walked to the sliding door, making sure it was locked. My hands shook as I pulled the curtains shut, cutting off my view of the yard. For a few minutes, I just stood there, listening. The wind was louder now, rustling the leaves against the fence, but I couldn't hear any footsteps or voices. Eventually, I convinced myself that whoever it was had probably moved on, but the unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. By midnight, I was upstairs in bed, scrolling through my phone in an attempt to distract myself. The house was eerily quiet, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards as the wind pressed against the old walls. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I'd locked all the doors and windows. I was safe. Then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping sound. At first, I thought it was coming from the front door. I sat up, straining to hear, but the noise wasn't coming from downstairs. It was coming from the window right above my bed. My stomach dropped. The tapping continued, deliberate and slow, as though someone were running their fingernails against the glass. I wanted to believe it was just a branch swaying in the wind, but the pattern was too intentional. Gathering my courage, I turned my head toward the window. My breath caught in my throat. There, pressed against the glass, was a man's face. His skin was pale and waxy, his eyes wide and unblinking. He wasn't angry or menacing, just vacant, like he was studying me. The corners of his mouth twitched into a faint, unnatural smile. I bolted out of bed, my heart hammering in my chest. Grabbing my phone, I stumbled into the hallway and locked myself in the bathroom. My hands shook as I dialed 911. I whispered to the operator, explaining what was happening, but my voice was barely steady. As I spoke, I heard something downstairs. A loud thud, followed by the sound of the sliding door creaking open. My blood ran cold. I told the operator that someone was in the house. She urged me to stay on the line and keep myself hidden, but I couldn't just stay there. Armed with the only weapon I could find, a heavy ceramic soap dish, I crept out of the bathroom and down the stairs. The living room was dark, and the curtains swayed slightly where the door had been left open. My eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement. Then I saw him. He was standing in the kitchen, partially obscured by the shadows. He wasn't rummaging through drawers or looking for valuables. He was just standing there, staring at the fridge. In his hand, he held something shiny, my house key. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The man didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head, almost like he was confused by my question. Then, slowly, he raised his free hand and pointed at me. I backed away, my grip tightening on the soap dish. "Get out," I yelled, trying to sound braver than I felt. But the man didn't move. He just stood there, watching me. Suddenly, he dropped the key onto the floor with a sharp clink. The sound echoed through the silent house. Without a word, he turned and walked out the open sliding door, disappearing into the night. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling so badly I could barely turn the latch. The police arrived 10 minutes later, but by then, the man was long gone. They found no footprints, no signs of forced entry, just the key he'd taken from the lock earlier. For weeks, I couldn't sleep without checking every window and door at least 3 times. Even now, years later, I still catch myself glancing toward the windows at night, half expecting to see that pale face staring back at me. And every so often, I hear that faint, rhythmic tapping in my dreams.